It's Wednesday, July 7th, so happy Wednesday to you. And if you've been looking forward to July 7th, it's finally here. And it's Common Good Faith Day here on the podcast. So joined by Stephany Spaulding, Dominique Gilliard, Laura Truax, and me, Doug Pagitt. I am in Minneapolis. They can tell you all where they're from. But please tell all of us where you're from. If you're watching on the live streams, let us know because we love to know those kinds of things. And if you are listening on the podcast, shoot us a note sometime. And thanks to all of you who do send those notes. We do get them. Whether they're the corrections you send to the podcast overall, the encouragements, or the... even the ones that feel a little bit more aggressive than that. So we appreciate all of those when they come. We're glad to be pursuing the common good with all of you. You know, this is a daily podcast, and on Wednesdays we take a theme of faith, and we're joined by faith leaders from around the country and from across different perspectives and different roles that we're all in. All of us doing our own expressions of life and faith and common goodness in the world. So good to see you all today. Glad to be back with the four of us. Haven't been together in a couple of weeks. So all right, here we go. We're back together, and hello to you, Stephany.
Hello, Doug, and hello, Laura, Dominique, everyone that's watching. It is a wonderful Wednesday. I am Reverend Dr. Stephany Rose Spaulding, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church of Colorado Springs. And I am excited that we have made it to this day. We are halfway through the year, and look at this. Look at this. I know, holy moly, who thought we would even get to 2021? And now we're halfway through it. So it's a wonderful, wonderful day to wake up with each other and to have conversations around faith. I'm going to throw it to Dominic.
Hey everybody, Dominique Gilliard. Excited to be here with you today. I am at an Airbnb in Savannah, Georgia, about to kind of take some time and some respite after getting through denominational annual meetings and a lot of the other jazz that has been 2021 so far. So excited to be here, excited for this conversation, and I'm going to kick it over to Laura to kind of frame what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. Laura Truax here, coming from Chicago, Illinois, on a stunning day here in this beautiful city. I am the pastor at LaSalle Street Church, located on the near north side of Chicago, and Chicago just is shining in the summer. So if you're from around the country and you don't get up to this region, to the upper Midwest, because you're thinking, oh, it's so cold up here. Yeah, I get that. And it is cold up here about 4 months of the year. But on a day like this in July, it's popping. So welcome, everybody. Hey, we wanted to queue up kind of on the shadow of Independence Day, July 4th, that national shrine of a holiday that we have. We wanted to queue up the idea of storytelling, the story we tell about America, both just collectively, as a people group, but then also, individually, the stories we tell about America. We wanted to cue that up and think with you about how we can tell a better story, a bigger story. Getting at the heart of origin stories. We all have one, right? I mean, we all tell the story of something about how we came to be, how these things came to be important to me, how these things came to be less important, the things I value and the things that I disregard, right? That's all part of our origin story. And at least at LaSalle on Sunday, and maybe for our listeners, maybe at their churches too, July 4th falling on a Sunday, it's only happened 34 times since 1776. How about it, right?
Somebody went on Wikipedia, didn't they?
Somebody nerded out. Googled. Yes, somebody nerded out. This girl. Because it's weird. I mean, I couldn't remember of another time, right, of when our day of worship also fell on July 4th. So 34 times, and I don't understand that. So maybe there's a listener out there who understands that whole process.
Calendar math.
Yeah, but calendar math. That's a good word for it. But I did. It did cause us anyway in church on Sunday to really think more deeply about the stories we tell about America. And at least for us, how we leaned into the day was to bring in the voices all along the way in our country's history, and I say our country's history, but really I'm thinking from the origin of the origin story we tell about July 4th, 1776, from voices from that time on, voices of indigenous people who talk about this is a day in which, for us, we remember our land being stolen and the importance of our land and our own story, our story. We talked about, we brought in the letter that Abigail Adams writes to John Adams, the second president of the United States, where she reminds him in the throes of the Continental Congress to, quote, remember the ladies. If you don't give us some voice, then make no mistake, we will start a revolution of our own. You know, we brought in the voices of Frederick Douglass, 1852, his some of his writings around what does this country mean to me? What does it say about the enslaved people and the stories we tell about that? We brought in Sweetwater Briargrass, who talked about her own experience of the day, you know, all the way up to Langston Hughes and his powerful poem of America Has Never Been America to Me. So, you know, I say all that because I think, how far can we stretch this story of America? Is there a way we can tell our story of our country and our roles in it that keep expanding, that keep that honor the fullness of it, not the small story of that we like to tell, whatever story that is, but the bigger story that's way more complicated and way more tortured and way more in need of being ever corrected, right? Being ever changing, ever redemptive, ever repentant, that story. So I guess maybe I'll just stop there, huh? I mean, that's kind of the thing we want to orbit around today, is this big story of that we tell. Yeah, our big stories.
Yeah, and it is a big one. You know, I was thinking when you started into this, like, what are the little pieces we tell about July 4th? And for whatever reason, I remembered that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826, right? This like interesting little factoid. Yeah. That both of these guys, all those years later, within 5 hours of each other, living in different places, you know, it wasn't a suicide pact or anything, but they end up sort of dying this day. And that's this little factoid that sticks in my head. And then there's a whole lot of other stuff that nobody ever gave me as little factoids sticking in my head, right? Like, it was a long time before I knew about some of the other stories of how indigenous peoples were treated, or, you know, no one was emphasizing the fact that that women were not included, and that slave peoples were not included, and that some people were brought to this country not as migrants, not as immigrants, not as wanting to come, but as slaved property. So all of that, like why some pieces are included and why are other pieces not included, like that's the conundrum that, frankly, I realize because this week some of our family's around. It's my own birthday, and so my kids are in town, and our kids are now in adult age. And my son went, and who's 30, went and hung out with my sister, so his aunt, and then we had breakfast, my son and I, and he said, "Hey, when you and Dee Dee were kids, she said that you used to go work at this thing together with mom and dad, with your mom and dad, and clean this place." And I said, "Oh yeah, we totally did that. Did I never tell you about that?" He goes, "No, you never told me that." Right. And I was like, "Really? I feel like I told you that stuff all the time." It's like, I had no idea. I'd never heard it. And so somehow in this like microcosm of like him putting the pieces together and like this family puzzle, you just realize, man, we're all doing that at a lot of different levels, trying to hold the pieces together and what have we heard and what have we retold and not. And I felt a little bit of like, wow, what else have I forgotten to mention, about my own childhood that I feel like was so obvious.
It's such a complicated conversation, right? Particularly for those who are, consciously and socially connected and aware. On the one hand, as an African American woman, there is the reality that independence and the language of independence, freedom, liberty is not something that is so easily applicable to the experience of being Black in America, right? So there's that, and the tension that it brings. But there's also, from a pastoral and national and citizenry space, there is, and I say that very intentionally, in terms of citizenship, because that complicates the conversation as well, is that we have the space, and I have to honor and recognize the privilege of living in a place where I have the space to critique its faults, its failures, and shortcomings, right?
Right.
Looking at what's happening in some other global spaces, whether that is in East Asian countries, or South America, Middle East, or whatever, there is not the liberty, so to speak, to publicly speak out against the kind of government that is in power and in place. And to be vocal about the shortcomings of both history and present, and potentially future of one's nation. And so, as much as I sit in a place of critique for the United States and its history and its past, and what liberty means, what independence does and does not mean, I recognize it's a first world privilege to be able to say and to speak that very publicly. And I don't take that for granted either.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you do that kind of from a good place. I mean, if people really want to look at this, both Dr. King and James Baldwin have great quotes on what patriotism looks like, and how critique flows from actual, authentic, deep love for a country and wanting the country to be kind of the best manifestation of itself that it could possibly be. And I remember I posted a quote on social media yesterday that said something like, true patriotism, like, is most angry about injustice and oppression within its borders. And, I think we have to expand and expound our understanding of like what patriotism is. And the critique is not just a critique because of disdain or hatred. Is a critique because I know what we have the capacity to be. I know what we could do if we truly did seek the common good. And so let's empower each other and spur each other on to kind of not only envision, but embody and enact that, so that we can actually be all that we declare ourselves to be. But I think, even kind of flowing from Stephanie's reflection, I think all that is true. And I think what we also have to really reckon with is that this country and its independence is born out of protest, out of resistance. And so it's so interesting how, when we sit with that historical fact, and then how we respond to protest and activism within our midst today and since then, I think that should really help kind of frame some things for us. But also, even when we look at Frederick Douglass's words in his iconic speech, that speech is a protest. Douglass was asked to give that speech on the 4th, and he said he refused to, and he gave it on the 5th, because he said that the 4th was not a day that affirmed freedom for Black people. And so I think there is this long, rich, robust history of resistance and protest that is at the fiber of what it means to be American. But I think because that protest doesn't isn't packaged in a particular way sometimes, I think then protest starts to get renounced and denounced as unpatriotic and un-American. But it's about as American as you can get, and it is because of the first world problems that Stephany talked about, but that is one of the freedoms and one of the privileges and one of the liberties and blessings of being an American citizen, to be able to protest and raise our voice to call us to something better, richer, fuller, truer, more free. And as the more we do that work together, the more we will manifest kind of what our Declaration of Independence points to imperfectly, but still points to.
Yeah. Dominic, it does make me think that we're 6 months out from that violent insurrection led by what I think was organized terrorists supporting Trump's reelection at the Capitol on January 6th. And the scary thing to me is that's the same language they were using.
Yes.
They were claiming this as 1776. They were rooting their current violent rejection of the presidential election and willingness to beat police officers with Trump flags and American flags and saying we are, this is 1776. That's what's happening. So I think this country has always struggled with that, right? We've struggled with the narrative that we were born out of a bloody revolution against the then, recognized government of the United States in an armed insurrection against the government of England, and trying to not but we call I don't know, there was some point, I think this was a bigger conversation back around the Iraq war time, that like one person's freedom fighter is another person's insurrectionist and terrorist, right?
Exactly.
That question, and we haven't done a lot in our culture and society to recognize this, right? Like what do we do? And maybe this country was just born into all of that. And perhaps that's why we've maintained a story of violence and war, the necessity for violence and war ever since. I don't know. I find myself totally agreeing 100%, like protest and we the people and redressing our government and all the things that we do with the 4th of July and our freedoms. And that's first of all, the only thing I know and the thing I love. And then I'm like, but it's terrifying when other people take that and use it in a way that is going to be so violent and so dangerous. So I think that's the very point that I feel this like tension of because frankly in my Christian faith, I'm a pacifist in the Christian faith, and then I'm like, I don't even know how to roll that in, right? I just have, I don't even know. I just have to say, like, I don't know. It's a good thing I didn't live during those times, and I can live when like voting is the way that we're overcoming our governmental restrictions until these people came along and attacked our government.
I agree. And, for somebody who's really a kind of Kingian pupil of protest and nonviolent civil disobedience, I think there are nuances for sure for how protests should look for the people of God. And so I think there was definitely that language articulated in association with January 6th, but there was not that spirit embodied. And I think for me, one of the reasons why it's so important for us as faith leaders to be out in protest is so that we can actually model what it looks like to be distinctively Christian in the midst of our public resistance to things that are thwarting the common good. And so, I think too often we become armchair theologians and critiquing what's going on out there from the comfort of our own home. But really what our faith should compel us to do is to be right there in the midst. And as we see kind of protests kind of getting derailed or sidetracked by other things, we can really kind of remind people of the core of why we're here and how we bear witness distinctively to who and whose we are through how we protest, the manner in which we do it. And so, everybody can come, land in different places with that in regards to, because I'm not the dictator in that regard. But for me, that's what informs my protest and my understanding of how kind of these things are informed by our faith and what does it look like for us to distinctively bear witness
and not
in
just
the midst of raising our moral voice.
not just armchair theologians, we are also revisionist historians, right? And so to
Come
both
on.
Doug and Dominique's point, when we look at the insurrection of January 6th and we blanketly say like they didn't have the spirit of 1776, it's reductionist and in a lot of ways incorrect, right? Like that, like the way in which some of those insurrectionists saw what happened in 1776 and what they were doing is really at the heart and the root of what this nation is, right? And establishing a very white, male centered, pseudo Christian space that looks a particular kind of way. And to not say those things, to not articulate that as very intricate and integral to the shaping of who we know ourselves to be in this
Yes.
moment is to be again, is to forget history and to also perpetuate an idea that there are not fundamental flaws with who we are as a nation structurally. When when we hear protesters and actionists of today saying the system isn't broken, it is functioning in the exact way it was designed to function, there is a truth to that, right? And
Right.
having to deal with that, yes, we created the monster that we are living with right now. Like, we are the Dr. Frankensteins of this monster that is rearing its head right now. And if we don't recognize that, we aren't going to rid ourselves of A, the hypocrisy, and B, the kind of deconstructing that needs to happen in order for us to become, as Dominique pointed out, to become that more perfect union, right? To establish ourselves in such a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that, Stephanie. I love this chat that Abdullah Peter Bradshaw is putting in. How far can we stretch the story? Who we are or what we are. I mean, she's asking these questions around just how broad can the story stretch? And I keep coming back to, why do we have such a hard time telling the fuller story? And I think for us as leaders to articulate the answer to that question, or to open that space for people to ask that question, we have to be willing to ask it of ourselves. You have to be able to think, where are the places in me where I'm so busy defending the pseudo origin story, the story I want it to be, right? I want to be this way in the world. And so because I want to be that way, I want to hide all this other crap that's just like, doesn't fit the story,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reminded of that place in the election where Marilyn Williamson, isn't that her name, the spiritual teacher? And it was on one of the stages where she talked about I think she described it as the negative psychic energy of our racist past.
Yeah.
And until we articulate that and haul it into the public arena where we're all talking about it and looking at it and analyzing it and naming it and just putting that into the story, until we do that, we'll never be free from it. We'll never be able to even start to tell a better story or live a better story. And that's true corporately, and that's true individually.
Mm-hmm,
and until we have this massive number of leaders who are willing to do that work, right, and model that work, we're just going to be stuck in these small defensive positions that guard this cheap, truncated, half-assed story. And it's never going to be the story that we are called to be. It's never going to be the story that Dominique referenced, right? The America we could be, right?
Yeah. And it does seem like it needs to be this is an ongoing issue, right? Like every generation, every group of people struggles with the same thing, right? Which piece of the story, both nationally in our own states, in our cities. I don't know where you all live, but where I live, we're constantly having these conversations in our state about renaming lakes and renaming high schools that are named after people that folks are like, I don't want my school named after Sibley anymore. That guy was the one who was in charge of relocating the indigenous people. Like, these stories are going on all the time. And that's the part that some people push back against, right? They'll just say, like, when's it ever going to end, and who's going to be next, and who's next on the chopping block, and all of this kind of thing.
Right.
I want to just share this little quote that a friend of mine, a friend from Facebook, posted, an in-person friend, Sam Kendrick, just yesterday, and I thought this was really poignant to our conversation today. Here's what I find interesting about this. Sam is someone who would find himself now to be in the moderate category, used to put himself much more in the conservative category. Somebody that was part of a project we did called Hindsight 2020 of people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and did not vote for Donald Trump in 2020, lives outside of Phoenix, Arizona. So he's one of these people that's just had a lot of shift and change. So he writes this, and I think this is sort of maybe a pivot point for us on some of this conversation. Sorry, I've got to change the little screen here because I dropped poor Stephany right off the screen there. Hi, Stephany. Welcome back. If you're watching on the screen, it's the magic of how this all works. So he writes, happy 4th, everyone. Yeah, I know it's the 6th of July today, but I don't want to be that guy who pees into your Cheerios on the 4th of July. You see, I have a question for you. I believe that we should celebrate the 4th of July because America is a pretty awesome place, and freeing ourselves from British rule paved the way for us to have a country like this. Still, when you all celebrate the U.S. as the land of the free and the home of the brave, does the mass killing and colonization of the natives that were first here cross your mind, or the enslavement of the African people? Do those two historical facts temper your celebration or patriotism at all? I'm genuinely curious, and I really think he is. And he goes on to say, I can't seem to divorce those things from my mind when I talk about freedom in this land. I'm grateful to be here, but I want to be intellectually honest with how we got to this place in our history as well. Yeah. Now here's Sam. He's not a theologian. He's a Christian guy, but, would just sort of be in that category of just a regular guy. And he will tell you that 2.5 years ago, he woke up to a lot of this stuff, right? And he's now like, no, this really matters. And he and his wife have adopted 2 girls from African descent. And so they've got that story. I think somebody's got a buzzsaw going on in the background. So they've got that story in their heads, as well, about their own family narrative. And I think a lot of people are awakening to this. I think it's now maybe every generation says this. People hit sort of a certain age and they've woken up to the world and they're kind of paying attention. But I don't know how the rest of you feel about it. But I really think there truly is something afoot that a lot of people are tapping into.
Yeah.
And I would even say about Sam's comments, for me, I don't even necessarily want to temper our celebration of independence, but I want it to be informed by those other realities that he talks about. I had somebody, really articulating a frustration of how accounting for these other realities really does kind of make it hard to celebrate. And they felt guilt about celebration. And, for me, I think we're more complex individuals than an either or. We don't have to subscribe to that kind of logic. I think we have the capacity to do the both and. And so for me, I don't even I really appreciated the quote, but I know for some folks, temper is hard. And so I just want to say, not even temper, but just inform. Like, those things have to inform our understanding of what does it mean to acknowledge and celebrate the 4th. And without it, it's not an authentic reckoning of who we are, like he kind of points to towards the end. And the other thing I just say real quick, Doug, about the question, because it is a question that we get, or a commentary that we hear a lot, like who's next and what else is kind of up for this kind of reform. And my thing is, this conversation should shine a very bright light on for how long so many people didn't have access to speak into these realities, and they were dictated for us, and it wasn't something that we commonly and collectively agreed upon to start with. And so now that there is more space at the table and more ability for other people who have been excluded from these conversations to be able to speak into it, now we're actually seeing how the decision-making process should have went from the start. And so we're actually making up ground in these conversations. And I think instead of folks feeling like we're like throwing away history, we are actually being invited into a co-curation and a real democratic process of what it means to actually declare what things are and who should be revered and honored and acknowledged for the lives that they lived and the legacy and integrity in which they embodied.
Yeah. Dominique, I so agree with that. I feel like if we could have a conversation, and Mike Dufresne in our chat here is talking about, we need this larger conversation on fact checking our collective stories. But even beyond that, I think we just need to have a conversation about how big the story is. I mean, I've mentioned this book before by this Harvard historian, Jill Lepore, These Truths, the Story of America. It's a tome. It's like 750 pages. But her central theme of the book is that the messy story, the story that is these lovers' quarrels. I mean, that's William Sloane Coffin's phrase, when he critiques America. It's a lover's quarrel he is having. I am in this relationship. I am American, but I've got a lot of bones to pick. I've got a lot of things that need to be said, and so do you. And that somehow a nation that's telling that larger story, the complicated story, the story of of what we've done awful, and the struggle to always be better, and the struggle to repent collectively, collective repentance, and a collective vision for a bigger and better place for all. That is, God, that's such an inspiring story, isn't it? I feel like there's a path for leaders to tell that story. I think a lot of people, like the guy, Sam. Sam wants to be telling that story. Yeah. God bless him. He's looking for, is there anyone who can tell this story with me? Yeah. Is there anyone who will come alongside me and teach me and help me like find my story in that bigger place? That requires a lot out of all of us. But boy, that's the only story worth telling.
And it's the path to accountability, right? That I agree. Let's think about the complexity and the fullness of what we are saying, what we are telling, what we are iterating, and even what we celebrate. But then also put hand to plow and do the work that is necessary to be conciliatory, to recognize again that even these centuries later, post 1776, that there is still not independence for communities of people that occupy this space, right? That there is still not justice and liberty for all, that the Star-Spangled Banner doesn't have the same resonance for everyone that is present. And we have to continue in that space of protest, in that space of self-correcting, to get us to a place that is truly worth celebrating in this quote unquote experiment of democracy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that is really important. And, the Christian tradition is one that's supposed to help you with that, right? Like the Christian tradition is supposed to prod people to caring about not only what they've done in the past that has been harmful and they live with regret. But what they're currently doing now, right? This is part of the thing that you're called to is what's the lived reality. And I think that very often, and you certainly hear this if people listen to the reading of the Frederick Douglass, "What is the 4th of July to a Slave?" argument that he made in 1852. What's true then and is true in on July 7th, 2021, that the church and churches are often complicit in wanting to cover up the things that have gone on in our own faith, in our own traditions, in our own literal churches and congregations, the things that have been difficult in the past and are currently going on, and the things that have been historic and have been nationally focused. And we really lack an ability in this country to deal with regret and to deal with a sense of failure. Like we say that we're a country built on all, like there's a myth of it all, right? That's like, this is the country where you can fall down, and like Muhammad Ali, if you get knocked down 7 times, you get up 8 times, and we all just sort of rise up and say, yes, that's the story we want to tell. But then we don't want to do that. And you see the conservatives pushing back really hard right now on critical race theory. Now, many of them don't understand the complexity of critical race theory, and we don't need to lecture them about the ins and outs. They do get the point that it's people trying to say this country has been rooted in systemic racism, and that racism is currently functioning today and it harms people, and that needs to be addressed and corrected at a systemic level. They got that point finally. But what they've said is that's not true. It's not happening. There is a push about the history of this country to say it was never racist. It will never be like there is a counter narrative right now to all the stuff we're talking about. And you can see it in right-wing media, and you'll see it in Christian homeschooling, and you'll hear it in churches where people are like, oh no, we are so far. Our problem isn't we don't know how to confess this stuff. The issue is some people are lying to us. They're trying to recast our history in a way that's not true. Like these are the good old days is not like a memory trick to some people, and it's got a serious amount of cultural support. The good old days is the way you tell history. It's not just the trick that you use. And I think that's what we're facing now. I think we've always faced it. I don't think it's any different, but I do think it's out front and it's part of the public discourse in a way now that is really different than the way that it ever has been. I think we're in a more structured argument about the history of this country, of our own faith, than we ever have. That people are arguing that the things that we all take for granted about our history were not actually true, or if they were exceptional and they were dealt with, and that's a sign that we're all that much better.
Yeah. And I will say, go ahead, Dominique. Yeah.
I'll just say part of it comes down to the classic conversation about intentions versus impact. And so our denomination, we just voted at our annual meeting to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, which is an important step in acknowledging these things that we're talking about. And some of the conversation of resistance was around, well, yes, this might have happened, but look at all the good that also happened. And look at all the people who came to know God as a result of these kind of missionary endeavors. And so, again, this inability to live in the complexity that there is both good and bad. And that just because there might have been some good that came from it doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge and reckon with the bad. I think that's a sign of maturity, that you can move from black and white thinking to the shades of gray, and you can actually live in the reality that there is both good and bad. And I think part of the fear that drives some of the resistance is that if we really do have to reckon with the fact that so many of our founding fathers actually were slave owners, and so many, these people that we revered historically actually did have these kind of negative elements of their historic record, then we no longer can celebrate them. And so if we can't celebrate them, and these have been our heroes and our kind of national icons, then what do we have left? And so I think that's a real part of the fear that's kind of at play, that that a lot of people are really trying to reckon with. And I think as Christians, I think, again, like you said, Doug, we have different tools to be able to engage these conversations, and they should lead us to a different place. And I think that different place is having the emotional and spiritual maturity to live with the both and, instead of opting for the shallower option of the either or.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think from,
Yeah,
like
but man,
Christians should certainly be able to really understand that concept, that construct, or what have you, because it's as simple as, what did you need saving from? Like, if there was no sin, like what was the point of Christ if there was nothing wrong with us before, right? So how can we address the complexity of who we are, particularly from a spirit space, of our beautiful imperfections, our collective flaws, to recognize that this is who we are growing into from a place of, human and spiritual maturity.
yeah. Um, yeah, I feel like the Christian story itself, we are riddled with the struggle to name our own past. So, I mean, I think that's a whole nother conversation, right? Just as Christians, the Christian church right now, we are intertwined with so much systemic sin that it's hard to unravel that thread, right? I want to just say a quick thing that's happening in Chicago for those people who don't know is that Lakeshore Drive, a portion of Lakeshore Drive, in the last week, 2 weeks rather, has been renamed, and it's Jean-Baptiste du Sable Lakeshore Drive. And that's just cool, right? That's just cool. It took a lot, but going back to, I think, what we've said earlier in this podcast, there is something shifting. There's some kind of consciousness that's in motion right now. And I've lived in Chicago for 28 years, and that conversation never really saw the light until this year. It never really got a good hearing until this year, and it passed. And that's just pretty awesome. And hey, I'm sorry to have to nip out a little on the early side today, but I've got to. So peace to all of you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Laura. Good to have you with us all today. But I think we're going to keep going. I'm just going to drop Laura out and throw Stephany on the screen and let you start talking stuff.
Absolutely. And I do think that there is a conscientious shift to begin for a lot of people who were not having these conversations before. Like you said, your friend Sam, there are so many like him who are looking at what is happening in our nation right now, particularly post-Trump and post this insurrection on the 6th, who are really willing to open their hearts and minds to the possibility of this conversation. And leaning into that, again, is going to, as some have said, move us to a place that we have not been before, but can help us get to where we articulate we want to be, where we envision ourselves going. So hopefully we are resistant and resilient enough to keep leaning into that.
And I would also say, Laura raised how unique it was for Sunday to be the 4th. I think is really prophetic in the year that we have the attempted
right.
Capitol insurrection, that where Christian nationalism
nose.
is the driving force of that. For the 4th to actually come on a Sunday, it was an opportunity for us as the church to acknowledge the ways in which we have muddied the waters of nationalism and Christianity, really articulating a faith in too many instances where being a good citizen and being a Christian are synonymous, and really to reckon with the ways in which we have not been clear about the distinctions between what does it mean to faithfully follow Jesus and to pledge our allegiance to a flag. Like there are definitive distinctions that exist, and we have not been consistent and concise enough about what those distinctions are.
Yeah.
And I saw Sunday as an opportunity for us to be confessional about that, for us to acknowledge that, and to really start to do the work of reformation in repentant spirit, to really be more Christocentric and clear about what it means to be commissioned to be an ambassador of reconciliation
Yeah.
of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as opposed to some of what we saw articulated and celebrated on at the Capitol.
Yeah, I think about how when people are dealing with grief, and if you go to a grief counselor, they remind you that there are these phases, or sometimes referred to as stages of grief, right? That you sort of are in shock, and then you start to bargain, and then you deny that it ever happened, and you finally reach a point of anger, and then some acceptance, and you swirl around those until you finally end up more often on the acceptance phase than you do inside of the others. And it's super helpful for people who are going through grief to realize what's happening. I wonder if we don't need something like that for people as they wake up, right? As they sort of reach their awokenness around issues like this, to help people realize, oh yeah, like at some point, Dominique, I'm thinking of your comments earlier, which I thought were so helpful, to say like, well, maybe tempering isn't quite the right phrase you need to get. That's something that feels sort of right at the beginning. And just the fact that we don't really have a process for people as they come to deal with the realization that things they've been told just aren't so, or what they've been told isn't enough of the story. We don't really have that built into our society. We're really not very good at that. And it seems like that might be the kind of thing that people in spiritual places of our society could be developing for us as a collective resource for the broader community, just to know the human practice of recognizing, oh, wow, I'm now awakening to things I didn't have the opportunity or didn't take the opportunity to know before. And what do I do with that? Because we've all worked with people who've gone through this, and man, there's a pretty predictable pattern, right? I don't know if either of you could talk about that, and people you're working with in your own life who are starting to waken up to these issues, and they're saying like, oh my, you can watch the pattern repeat of how people are feeling, what they're doing, how they're acting. And when I was a youth speaker back, I'm thinking 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago at youth camp, you give kids a great week at camp and a great spiritual experience. Then you're like, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen when you go home. Here's what's going to happen, right? Like, you're going to miss these people, and you're going to have these feelings, and all this stuff is going to happen. Look, we're pretty good at that in some arenas, but we're really not very good at that in the general sense of how people come to realize the kinds of regrets or the kind of awakening that they have found about themselves. Because you don't want people coming home like that sophomore in college that tells their parents, hey, I just learned a bunch of stuff in college that you never told me, so you apparently don't know this, and yada, yada, yada. And it's that difficult sophomore year, after sophomore year for college students when they go home and tell their families off. Like, that's not the story we want.
Yeah, I've had plenty of those sophomores come through my class. But I mean, again, I encourage it because
it's a good
there
stage.
are a lot of things that their parents didn't tell them, and their parents didn't tell them because they don't know. I think that's the other push when we think about the stories that we tell. To go back to one of the earlier comments in the chat, it not just around fact checking, but ignorance being intentionally part of a national agenda to dumb down Americans. And we're seeing this play out again with this assault on critical race theory where, folks don't even know what critical race theory is and what it does. And they perceive that they could even ban it. Like, you can't ban, yeah. But this anti-intellectualism is very much a part of how we get to this place of not knowing. And it's an agenda item. It is a political social agenda item that has been in play in the United States since the Cold War. So we are really fighting against this not knowing, right? Not ignorance in a denigrative sense, but this really truly not knowing, because we have generations of people who just don't have, this information at their fingertips, or at the base of their knowledge.
Yeah, not to jump into, a hardcore Trump rant, which I could do at pretty much any point. But just on Saturday, he was at a rally and he brought up this fact that his business is being prosecuted for tax crimes. And what he said there was, these people didn't pay taxes on a car or an apartment or tuition for their grandkids. Like, who even knows that that's the law? How would you even know that that's what you're supposed to do? And that argument that it's unknowable, you couldn't possibly know, I mean, it's just too complicated. Why don't we just live in a simpler world? That's usually the stuff people say in secret and in quiet. It's now an absolute standard way of functioning and practicing in our society. And we all have to check ourselves that we don't want to become those people, right? Like, well, there's just too much to pay attention to. And, I know myself, I can get that way with people that have religious ideas and political ideas. I can sort of ignore them or laugh at them or think that they're just simply dangerous and not take them seriously. And we shouldn't do that with any information, right? We should be checking all the information that we can and trying to incorporate all of it. But we're now in a place, Stephany, I think to your point, that is just more dangerous than we have ever been because of the distribution of information and because of the kinds of people with certain political and cultural power that are using these arguments the way that the Trump clan is doing it, that is just extremely risky and dangerous for the well-being of this society. That's actually what the Constitution was all about, right? I mean, that's the whole reason they put a We the People government together, was to resist this very thing. So I just find it to be ironic in that sense.
I mean, I think when we look back at, our founding documents and we see certain people like indigenous people referred to as merciless Indian savages, like, I think it's pretty hard to not reckon with the fact that we have not been a nation that really has kind of affirmed the fullness of what we the people should include. We have not reflected the fact that all people are inherently made in the image of God and hold equal worth and value. Like, that's just like, there's really hard to try to skirt around that. But I think, as Christians, I think for me, what's really important is, like, if we really were to take a Philippians 2 mindset, when we hear things that like agitate us or that doesn't align with our worldview, the temptation is to deny and to kind of turn your head. But that the spirit should really compel us to press in and to listen harder and more intently and actually see, why does my neighbor feel this way? Like, what is going on that makes them not see and celebrate this in the same way that I do? How does a speech like Douglas's speech actually give me new insight into some of the things that I haven't fully considered yet in regards to kind of the way that I've lived my life and exercised my citizenship? Should freedom actually be nuanced in a new way because of the lived experience and the witness of my neighbors who have had a different experience of our nation? And as we listen to each other together and work together for the common good, could we actually manifest this new, more robust articulation of what it means to actually be the land of the free and the home of the brave? Are we brave enough? Do we have the integrity and the fortitude to press into these difficult conversations instead of retreating to denial and acting as if this stuff is not real when, the evidence is right before our eyes? And so that's really, there are some problematic tenets to everything. So like don't hear me as saying like, oh my gosh, this is the whole scale endorsement of CRT or anything. Like there are elements of it that need to be refined in some ways, particularly from a Christian worldview. But what I am saying is denial is not the answer. It's not a faithful response to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is not a faithful response to the evidence that's before us. And as long as we continue to cling to that, we're going to, again, have these kind of circular conversations that bring us right back to this place and space. And we're not going to live as the ambassadors of reconciliation and people who are bearing witness to the inbreaking kingdom in the way the scripture commissions us to do.
So as we are, July 7th, I encourage people, as an educator, I encourage you to do an assignment that Mark Charles has done before, that maybe next Independence Day, or you can do it today, you can do it tomorrow, to rewrite the Constitution. Like literally go and actually read the Constitution and strike out, rewrite everything that is white supremacist, racist, sexist, abolish slavery, and add the value for life to the actual Constitution. Like look at it, every place that there's a reference to he, how do you use inclusive language in that sentence? Or how do you take out the racism that's in the sentence? Like go do that exercise for yourself and then do it with your family and read the Constitution in a different way that is honoring the diversity and the inclusivity that we say we desire. And if you can't figure it out for yourself, Mark Charles has already done it on his blog. So you can even look at Mark Charles Rewrites the Constitution. But it's an exercise to really get us thinking about who was excluded and what that continues to mean in our country right now.
That's a great word. I think that's a good place for us to wrap today, right? And that with a little reminder that we are the actors and the audience in this country, right? We're the ones watching it happen and the ones making it happen. Like we are future generations' history, and we are the founders' future. And so there's a sense in which the life that we live and how we live, and this is true of our nation, it's true of our faith, right? This is for me, this is the Jesus teaching that puts you in this great community of the past, present, and future, living in harmony with one another. And that's what we're called to do. And it's the human practice, actually. And I think it's a really great and wonderful thing. And I'm glad to be part of all of that with you, Dominique and Stephany and Laura, who had to cut a little bit early. So thanks all for being with us today. We will be back tomorrow. We're going to talk about some issues. And then on Friday, we're going to talk a little bit of economics. And we'll be back here, of course, next Wednesday. So happy 7th of July to all of you. And we will see you all next week.